And so it's my great pleasure to introduce our featured speaker today, who is an esteemed and award-winning Hardanger fiddler, composer, and author. Benedicte Maurseth has apprenticed under master fiddler Knut Hamre for several decades, specializing in the traditional music of Hardanger. She's toured extensively as a soloist within Norway and internationally, collaborating with numerous artists across genres, including theater, contemporary, and improvised music. Her latest solo album, Har, received the Nordic Music Prize and was recognized as one of the 10 best folk music albums globally in 2022. She was named Folk Musician of the Year in Norway in 2023. Among her publications is the book Fiddlesisters, a groundbreaking exploration of female fiddlers from the 18th century to the present. And this is the topic of her presentation today. Welcome, Benedicte.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction. And welcome to everybody who's listening today. I will talk about Fiddlesisters, the title of the book I wrote back in 2022, at least that's the time it was published. And I will speak about the role of female fiddlers in Norway within the fiddle tradition from the 1700s until today. And that is, of course, a quite big gap of history that I will try to give you an overview of this big topic for around next 45 minutes. And if you have any questions during this presentation, please note them down, and we'll have time in the end to answer questions. I want to go to the next slide, and we start with looking at this photo. It's taken of a group called Håndalstausene. And directly translated, that means the girls from Håndalen. And Håndalen is a municipality in the northwestern part of Norway. And I want to start with this photo because, as the title of the presentation says, it's also about the present day. And I think this photo is a very, very good description or presentation of the big change that happened within our fiddle tradition in Norway. From around 1970s, but really from the 1980s and 90s, it really exploded, the number of women who, again, picked up the fiddle and Hardanger fiddle. And to see a group perform like Håndalstausene was something quite special when they were very active in the 80s and 90s, something people have never seen before. And I think we should start with listening to how these women sounded, a recording they did back in, I can't say the year now. This was Håndalstausene, and I think this recording is from 1989. And the next slide is, yes, it's nice to have that in front of me now. But I want to tell you a little bit about when I was growing up. I started to play the Hardanger fiddle when I was 8 years old. So this was in the early 1990s. And I remember very well comments I got from people like, there's so many girls playing fiddle now, and oh, it's amazing what is happening now. It's like a wave of girls and women picking up the fiddle, and oh, they play so well. But this is not what we're used to. It's always been the men who have been playing the fiddle. But wow, this is good. So it was a very positive energy around it, but also it was. Yeah, I felt like I was a part of something new, something different, something, different from what was expected. Most people expected a man to play the fiddle at the time. And I also remember comments like, oh, what will happen to our tradition now when all the women are taking over? So it was, different kinds of feedback, but mostly it was very positive. And then much, much later in life, I heard that it had actually existed professional female fiddlers in Norway already in the 1700s, also in the 1800s. Women that were professional fiddlers, and when I say professional, I mean that they were hired to do a job as a fiddler for weddings, for dances, and probably other ceremonies. There were women who were masters, teachers. There were women who were composers of fiddle tunes. I heard about some families who had, 3 or 5 or 7 sisters, everybody playing the fiddle. Or in other families, I could find family members where the grandmother was playing, where the mother was playing, where all the aunts were playing, sisters and neighbors who were also women playing the fiddle. So in the 17 and 1800s, it existed, as the title of my book says, Fiddlesisters playing the fiddle, not only for joy and amusement, but as a profession. And of course, when I heard about this at a quite grown age, I found it very strange. I hadn't heard about it before. Nobody ever told me about this until I was in my late 20s. No teacher I had, no other musicians I met, nobody. So I started to investigate the most referenced literature we have in Norway when it comes to our folk music tradition. And I almost found nothing about it. But I asked myself the question, if it existed, this tradition of female fiddlers, and this was especially in the northwestern part of Norway, I will show you a map very shortly. If it existed like a tradition like that there, could I find similar traditions in other parts of the country if I just started to investigate? So that's what I did. I just started traveling around all over Norway, especially in the south part of Norway, going to different villages, different museums, interviewing so many people, researching anything I could find, visiting the places where I knew the women once lived, because I wanted to see the landscape they once saw. I wanted to check if there were any fiddles left, any other belongings they owned once, and so on. And this took me years, at least 8 years before it ended up in this book, Fiddlesisters, eller Systerspel in Norwegian. It only exists in Norwegian. But and during the work, I came across quotes like the one you see in front of you. It is noted here that as the men played, the girl wandered around and listened, ultimately becoming the true fiddle player. A quote like that is so precious when you have doing a work like this, where you find very little material. And this quote is about one of the best fiddle players in northwestern part of Norway at the time, Samueline Seljeseth, born in 1804, as you can see. So if you go to the next slide then, you will see a map of Norway. to the right side, you see our entire country, not so big, but very long. And to the left, you see the southern part. And maybe you, Andrew, can try to find Stryn in the northwestern part area. Yeah, if you make a circle around that, maybe a bit wider circle also for the audience, you can see that area. I found so many women who played the fiddle, but really all over Norway once I started looking. We can go to the next slide. So one of the other amazing quotes I found that is quite famous is this one. And when the girls play just as fast, meaning good, like the men, it is not strange, rare, in a single house to find 2 and 3 people who understand how to play, either on violin, which is the most common instrument, or on a droned harp, which is langeleik in Norwegian, or on a harp, which is, however, the rare among them. In this way, the people spend their time with pleasure. And this was an observation written down by Hans Strøm, famous priest who wandered around, write down what he saw and observed traveling around Norway. And to the right side, you see this village, Norddal, in northwestern part of Norway. I went to visit this village too to see. So at the time in the 1750s, 2 or 3 people could play in each house maybe, and you could find both men and women playing. If we go to the next slide, there is also a fantastic quote. It says so much about the tradition at the time, also from the 1750s. Here I will briefly say something about their wedding customs. When they walk or ride to church, the man or woman, boy or girl who plays at the wedding is the first of the wedding assembly. So a quote like this, I didn't find many, but a quote like this says so much. When you play the Hardanger fiddle or fiddle growing up in Norway, you learn also, of course, a lot about the history. And we learned that the fiddle players' position were very important. It was an important job. In the 17 and 1800s, only the best players were asked to play in weddings. And for the best players, it could also mean significant income. So I think this quote from the 1750s tells us that man or woman doesn't matter for the people at the time. It's equal. And I just added a photo here of Ingebjørg Raftevold. That is the oldest photo I've found of a woman participating as a fiddle player in a traditional wedding from 1906. But we can go to the next slide. And I will show you here a photo of, it's taken by me after I visited a museum in Sandane in Nordfjord. And this fiddle is the oldest fiddle we know that was owned and used by a woman fiddler. Her name was Kristi Gabrielsdotter. You can see she was born in 1793. And the fiddle is from 1774. The oldest existing fiddle we know of, used by a woman. And this woman's quite, there are many fantastic stories about these women in older times. And Kristi Pastia especially is very notable, someone you remember because she didn't have legs or feet so she could not walk herself. So people would carry her on their backs or in a kind of stool when they asked her to perform for dance or weddings. So I think this says a lot about this woman, about her talent, her gift as a musician, because we know very well about other male players or other female players in the region where she lived. They could have asked them. It could have been much easier for them, but they wanted her to play. And this was her fiddle. And she was never married, very poor, it says, but she still had this fiddle. I find it very interesting. If we go to the next slide, I also show you here a photo of Hornindal. And that's the same place where the women on the very first photo I showed you, Håndalstausene, this is where they come from. But this is, of course, an old photo. And I wanted to tell you also about another fiddler, Synnøve Rasmusdotter Friisli, renowned fiddle player. And she is known for being the oldest fiddle player in general in Sogn og Fjordane fylke, we say in Norwegian. Is it county in English? I'm sorry, I don't know for sure. But what is most interesting is that they called her Spelar Synnøve. So that means Spelar means a fiddler, so it's Fiddler Synnøve. And you don't give that name to just anybody. She was known for being a fiddler, and there is also only one quote about her, and it says she played in hundreds of weddings. It says numerous here, but in Norwegian it says hundreds of weddings. And she was born in 1725. Again, you won't be asked to play for hundreds of weddings if you're not one of the best. And it was an important profession for many fiddlers, and an important extra income if they were asked a lot. It's very interesting that I can't find any written sources about what the women actually earned from working at these weddings. And so immediately you get a little worried that they didn't get paid, but I'm convinced that they had some kind of income. But it's interesting that we don't know anything about it, and we know in details what some men could earn for maybe just playing at one wedding, or more or less their year income. But we need to remember that doing a job as a traditional fiddle player at the time at weddings was not an easy task. It was very hard work. And you would play probably for 3 to 4 or 5 days in a traditional wedding. And you would take part of all of the ceremony in the wedding from the very start to the very end. So for these women to go away, to leave their homes and families and children, go on. Sometimes they went on feet by boat, or they took their horses with their fiddle cases. Some I read brought some of their children, and they had others to look after them, or they left them behind with their husbands. I don't think they would do that if it didn't bring some kind of extra income for them. So if we go to the next slide, we see another farm I visited when I traveled around gathering information. And let's have a look, let's have a listen to this tune as played by Lise Gyvald, a famous fiddler at the time. Shorten it before it's finished. Yes, sorry. But that gives you just a little idea of one of the tunes we know that she might have composed, or at least it carries her name. And that's also very interesting about this area, especially in the northwestern part of Norway, where we find several tunes carrying women's name. On the slide in front of you, you see photos I took of her fiddle case. When I visited the farm where she once lived, they still had her fiddle case, but no fiddle, no bow. The only thing left in the case was this piece of paper you see on your left side. I don't think it was a paper. It was ripped out of a book, and I'm not sure it was the Bible, but at least it had the words "Soli Deo Gloria," meaning in His honor, or in God's honor in Latin. So it is a religious text, and of course we don't know if she put it there. This text, this piece of paper. There in the case herself, but if she did, I think it's quite moving and makes me, it's quite moving that it would be important to her to keep these words with her as a fiddle player, that she's doing something in honor of God. She's playing fiddle in honor of God. If we go to the next slide, I don't have a photo or any object after this woman, but her name was Guri Gabrielsdatter Støverstein. She later took the name Lauvossen. Many of the people moved, the women moved and and then they changed their name. Wherever they moved, the new farm they moved to, they took the name. And this was quite an amazing woman. Many of these women in general were farmers. In general, women in Norway at the time, most people were farmers. That's what they did. But to make a living at the time, especially if you were in the western part of Norway, you didn't have a big land. So you needed to have several crafts, different kind of work to make a living. So, for example, Guri, she was fiddle player. We know she was a teacher for her children, but also for other people who wanted to learn the fiddle, visited her. We know she was probably composing tunes, at least there is tunes carrying her name. We know she was a farmer, and we know she also knew a lot about herbs and treated people with herbs. So in general, they had to have different kinds of skills and knowledge to make a living. If we just have a listen to one of the tunes that carry her name, it's a very nice tune. Thank you so much. So, as you see from this slide in front of you, I took some photos when I visited where she moved to in Møre og Romsdal. And the pile of stones you see is where one of her houses once were. 10 minutes walk, she had that view of the sea. And around her house, she had the land you see on the right side, and not much more than this land. So it's quite different farms from what I know exists in America. And as you can see, you can't make a living out of this land. And it's a kind of irony, I think, because that they didn't come from big farms and didn't have a lot of money and needed to be very dependent women. I think this was their salvation in a way. There needs to be more research to really be to say this to be more secure about what I'm saying now. But my impression with this work tells me that the more poor they were in a way, the more dependent they needed to be to make a living, and that made them more free to do other kinds of work. So we need to keep in mind that the women farmers at this time in the 1700s and 1800s were they had the primary responsibility of the farms, of the economy, of the families, of servants, if they had that, while their husbands often traveled fishing or had other kinds of craft. So the women at the time were very dependent, and we see that it's the case for all over south of Norway, the coast, all the way up to including the Sami people in the north. So I think this did something with the general view of a woman at the time, because they were so codependent of each other, man and woman. It did something with the general view of women, and again, also I think it affected the general view of a woman fiddler. It wasn't so strange or that a woman would play and perform at a wedding as equally as a man. We go to the next slide. Here is a photo, or several photos of the farm where Lisbeth Andersdotter lived. And in the left corner, you see the fiddle case. Again, also a fiddle case with no fiddle, no bow. And the reason for this is because she lost her husband, who died in a very young age. He drowned in the fjord. Many people could not swim at the time. But she was convinced that he died because she had played so much fiddle for dances and weddings, probably also. And because of this, she gave away her fiddle to one of the most famous fiddlers from Gudbrandsdalen, Lums Jakob. And so this is the time when things are changing really in Norway. We are now around 1840s, 50s, 60s. What happens is that we get freedom of religion in Norway in 1842. And that meant that you could have private meetings, you could preach from the Bible and not be a priest. So this became a big, big movement in Norway called Haugianisme in Norwegian. It led to different kinds of Christian revivalism that was combined with a new social reform. And during this period, it was very difficult for both man and woman to play the fiddle. It is during this time, around, again, the 1850s, 60s, that we hear about many fiddlers selling or giving away or even burning their fiddles. Many also lost their jobs. If they were a teacher and they also played the fiddle, they lost their job as a teacher. So this was very rough for both men and women when this Christian revival was so strict and so strong. And we need to remember that it was the farmers who really took Haugianismen to their hearts, and it was the farmers who were fiddlers for the traditional weddings and dances and so on. So it is around this time in the 1860s that I see that women are disappearing from the tradition. It was rough for both men and women, but it was really much, much harder to be a woman fiddler from after this change in our society. And at the same time, simultaneously, the traditional farming society also underwent a major change through the Industrial Revolution. And that meant that the woman farmer, the woman farmer who had this very strong position in the farms, lost her position. Gradually, she lost her position because her work changed so radically during the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution also led to new social customs that meant that we had less traditional weddings and dances. It changed. We wanted new dances, new ways of celebrating our weddings, and so on. So the job as a traditional fiddler was much. They were asked much less for this kind of work gradually during the 1800s and crossing over to the 1900s. So if we go to the next slide, there is a fantastic photo of this woman, Dora Nilsson. And I wanted to include her, especially for this presentation, because for a long time, I thought a woman you will shortly see, Christiane Lund, was the oldest woman we know of performing concerts. But just before this book, Systerspel, went into print, 2 weeks before I went into print, I got this amazing email from a woman sending this photo and a copy of an old letter where it says that Dora Nilsson performed concerts in America with Lars Fykerud, one of the most famous fiddlers in Norway. And this photo is fantastic. As you can see, she is holding a violin, and on the table she has a Hardanger fiddle. And because the book was going into print, I could not include this in the book, but I'm doing more research around her now. And she is a very interesting, she is a symbol of a big change that happens in our tradition at the time. She went to America, but still she performed concerts. And that's my point here, that the traditional player went from playing at weddings and dances primarily to being concert performers and also competing at kappleiks, competitions for fiddle and dance, especially fiddle in the beginning. But again, she immigrated to America, so she had her concert. She had her tours and concert experience in America. But again, it's very interesting that of all the texts or all the stories I've ever heard about Lars Fykerud, no one ever mentioned that he was touring with Dora Nilsson. She's left out of the story. And if you just have a little look into the material that exists about her, you find one concert advertisement after another, including both of their names. But when I was growing up, I only heard about him going to America. He was a big success. He made a lot of money and so on. Never any story about him performing together with a woman. Let's go to the next slide. And we see Christiane Lund from Bø in Telemark, and she really is a pioneer in Norway as being the first woman we know of that had her that was a professional performer, and all of her life, and very competitive and won many prestigious kappleiks where she she was competing with only men at the time. So it's a big change in our folk music tradition that we are now. It's a new era where the concerts and the competitions are the most important venues for performing this kind of music. But it also is a time where the women are more or less gone from the fiddle tradition. If they play, we only know a handful, I would say, that really made a name of themselves and really had the chance to make a living out of it. But most women, when you cross over to the 1900s, most women stopped playing, or when they got married, or they kept on playing, but they hid that they were playing, and so on. So it was not socially accepted anymore at the same level as it obviously was in the 1750s, from when you think about the quotes I read to you earlier in the presentation. Christiane Lund was also a pioneer because she was the first woman Hardanger fiddle player we know of that ever recorded on gramophone recording. And she did that when she was just turned 30 years old in 1919. Let's have a listen how she sounded. Is amazing, but we move on a little bit. The next photo is of Bergljot Valgren from a different part of the country, Røros. Now we are more northeast. And I love this photo of these women sitting outside, drinking coffee, probably tea, and the fiddler is in the middle of the photo. And I include this photo not because she was a very famous concert fiddler, but she is an example of most women at the time that actually stopped playing fiddle once they got married. There are quite a lot of quotes I could find from women that are born, around 1900, 1910, and that stopped when they got married in their 20s. It was no longer accepted in the same way as it was just 100 years before. You think that equality just is a curve that goes up and up and up, and we have the same rights, or at least we get how do I say it in English? We think that the curve is just going up, but it's going up and back and up and back and so on. So we need to take care of our rights. This is what this story is telling me very clearly. If we go to the next slide, we see an example of a woman who was not allowed to play the fiddle growing up. She had to hide so the neighbors wouldn't hear her, because her mother was quite ashamed of her, not of her playing, but if the neighbors could hear it. So it says a lot about, the atmosphere, what was accepted socially at the time. But she kept on playing. As you can see, she also had her own trio. Later in life, she moved to Oslo. We can hear just a little bit how she sounded. She's playing fiddle and not Hardanger fiddle. The next slide is showing Ellen Fera again, just an example of how women that were not married could make a living also as fiddlers. She was a servant, but she also took her fiddle and went to the train station in Røros and played for the visitors who came with the train. A fantastic photo of her, I think. Bakka Ellen. To the next slide, we also see an example of another woman fiddler who was a very talented fiddler, but also had to stop playing once she got married because her mother-in-law did not accept her playing. And when her mother-in-law passed away, she picked up her fiddle again and played until she passed. I think we will skip listening to her right now because I talk too much and time is moving forward. But this photo is also included, so you see only one woman, so many men. That's how it is at the time. During the 1900s until the 1970s, there were just a few women and mostly men playing fiddle and Hardanger fiddle. We can go to the next slide. Because these women were quite exceptional. On the left side, you see a poster of Signe Flaten Nese from Seljord. She performed concerts already at the age of 15. She toured with her father, who was a very famous fiddler and fiddle maker, Kjetil Flaten. And later in life, she also brought with her Torbjørg Aas Gravali. As you see, they sit in front of a car, maybe taken when they were touring. Two women at the time, and I think this was in the 30s. Nobody had ever seen this before. Two women traveling around playing the Hardanger fiddle. It was very well accepted. You can move on to the next slide. In general, I would say for these women that did play the fiddle and did it all of their lives or parts of their lives, all of them came from a family where they had very strong traditions within the family. All of them had a father, a brother, or uncle, or brothers who were open and including them in this tradition of playing fiddle. And that leads me to the next slide, because if we then look at Susanne Lundeng, we are now in the 1970s, and that is when women again are taking part of the tradition of playing fiddle in Norway. And I will say something about why, but we can move to the next slide and also have a look at a performance done by also one of the most famous women, Susanne Lundeng and Ambjørg Lien, I would say, were the most important representatives, together with Håndalstausen that you heard in the very beginning, that really opened doors for younger women that came after them, like me. And Ambjørg Lien is probably known for many of you listening today. She's been touring a lot in America, I know, before. But she was so talented and also very much included in media in Norway when she was young. And here she is at the age of 12 performing at one of the most famous TV shows at the time. You can have a listen. Yeah, as you can hear, a very talented young player. Here you can see a photo of myself when I was around the same age as Ambjörg, and I did not play like her at all at the time. But here I am with my teacher, Knut Hamre. I learned from him. Yeah, I still learn from him, but for many years. And so what happens from 1970s and onwards until today is that women again are taking part of the fiddle tradition. And of course, it has to do a lot with the general women's rights revival that is happening all over the western part of the world. Women are again taking part of society and work life and so on in a whole different level, taking higher education. There's so much things happening. But I would say the most important reason for this wave of women also taking part in our fiddle tradition again is that because the music, the tradition was taking from the 70s, it was included in music schools and later on in higher education, universities and other kinds of music educations. And because of this, you no longer were dependent on coming from a family where you had a father, brother, uncle, or grandfather who were interested in learning, teaching you this craft, this knowledge. Then you could come from any part of the country where this was offered to you. Like myself, I didn't come from a very rich folk music tradition. I just signed my name on a piece of paper in the music school, and I started to play the Hardanger fiddle. So suddenly, boys and girls, no matter where you came from in Norway, could have access to this knowledge that was before very much, I won't say protected, but was something you needed to come from a special family, or at least come from a village where it was a very rich tradition to get access to it. And when it was no longer socially acceptable for a woman to play the fiddle, of course, then you really needed acceptance from someone. So this really opened doors, and also to see people like Ambjörg Lien on television, Susanne Lunning, to see women that were brilliant in what they were doing, and they were again, we again as women or girls had role models in the same way as the women had in the 1700s. It's so important to have role models, and I think this affected it had so much impact on this big movement that came. And I could say more about how it was for many of these women who opened the doors. I write quite a lot about that in the book. I write a lot about being sexualized, being how do you say, infantilized.
Infantilized.
Yeah, infantilized, thank you. And I speak about how media were writing about the women, and how also the folk music community themselves were speaking about girls versus boys, or men and women and so on. But for now, I think I will just leave you with that. For those women who opened the first doors after being out of the tradition, I would say in general, for almost 100 years, was not an easy task, because we need to remember that it was the men then who had set the discourse alone of what a fiddler should be like, and how a fiddle play, how a performance should sound like, and all those codes that I don't know how to explain it, but all those codes that are like in the air in a way. And how to fulfill that, or how to really find your own voice as a woman fiddler. I think we're still looking for that space, for that voice. Yeah. And I want to leave you with a video. If we go to the final slide, I just want to end with saying that during the 8 years I worked on this project, I found so many names of women who had played the fiddle once. And after a while, I didn't know what to do with all the names. And I thought that if I don't write them down, they will disappear. And I gathered all the names I could find in the very back of the book. Women born between 1700 and 1950. And I stopped in 1950 because, as I tell you, it was so many women from the 70s and onwards. But these are all women that was, well, there is a quote I like to tell from a historian called Anna Tranberg, and it says, if there are thought for a woman, there are also words for her. And many of these names, many of these fiddlers, it has not been so many thoughts for them and not so many words for them. But they once lived here as well, and they also once played the fiddle. And I want you to have a look at this video just to see the names I found. And it's from the concert I made based on the book. Yes, this is all I wanted to say for this presentation now. And it's open for questions if there is any questions.
There are many questions.
Okay.
So a huge thank you from us. Today's presentation was just wonderful, and we are deeply grateful to you. Lorraine, I'll let you kick off the questions.
Well, naturally, there are many questions about your book, Fiddlesisters, and it's only in English at this time. Folks are wondering not only will it be available in English in the future, but where can they get a hold of a Norwegian copy? And we'll certainly check with our own museum store to see if it's possible. But let us know, what are your thoughts about having an English version of the book?
I think maybe I would have to edit it a little bit to make it work for a more international audience. But of course, of course there are many links to other, similar stories for women's in history in general. If you're a painter or if any kind of work in the history for women. So I've been asked this question a few times. I'm not sure. If someone asks and are interested in publishing and helping me getting it translated, I would be open to it. But so far, I have been a little bit exhausted after finished writing this book, so I haven't I haven't done anything more about it. But it's possible you can order it directly from me, or it's possible to order it from any bookshop in Norway.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll do some finding out, like you said, Lorraine, if we can get it through the museum store. When we send out the link, when this is posted on YouTube, we'll include a link either to Vesterheim Museum Store or information about how to source it in Norway. And for folks who are not able to read it in the original Norwegian, there are apps like Google Translate that you can use to help with something like that. Great. Another question that came up a couple different times is asking about fiddle music being referred to as the devil's music because it caused fights, being banned by the church. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yes, that's what I thought. I tried to explain, the change during the 1800s when especially the women disappeared from the fiddle tradition. And that was one of the reasons, because it was suddenly, or probably over some time, but it really... for some reason, it was connected with, the devil, the instrument. And I think especially the dance itself was probably the most, the biggest problem, because we know that many Christians used the fiddle playing psalms when they had their private meetings and so on. So it wasn't necessarily the fiddle itself, but it was more the symbol of what it led to: bad behavior, too much alcohol, and fights and so on. Yes, it did really happen, but of course, when you hear about the freedom between men and women earlier in the 1750s, it's really is a change of the social customs during the 1800s. It affected our way of living until today. I would say our mentality in Norwegian society still.
There are a number of musicians listening and watching today, and they're wondering about how to find some of the tunes that have been written by or played by women fiddlers.
Yes, when I published the book, I also published a CD. Double CD. It's also possible to listen to online on any streaming platforms. It's called Systerspel. And I gathered their recordings of women from 1919, Christiane Lund, until today. And the reason why I did this is because in the 1980s, or when was it? Sorry for mixing up the years, but at least many years back, it was released a CD called Systerspel with only men at the time. So I wanted to make a CD with only women. So from 1919 until today, it's Systerspel. I don't play on this recording myself. It's only me curating other women performing.
Thank you.
Another question that came is wondering, do you feel that there are still challenges that are unique to women fiddlers in Norway today? Challenges like lack of opportunities, intentional or unintentional erasure, feeling valued and respected? Can you speak about the
Yes.
contemporary
Yes,
experience?
it's a very important topic. I write about this in the book, and I could speak about it, but we would need another hour at least. I think it's a challenge still for the women to find their place. I think many find it maybe that I'm exaggerating when I'm saying this, because when you look at posters or festival programs or photos taking from folk music gatherings and so on, you see so many women. So immediately you might think that it's very equal, it's very included, it's the opportunities are the same and so on. But I did look thoroughly into the numbers, because you need to have numbers when you speak about what is equal or not between men and women, because it's very easy to be accused of being exaggerating or complaining and so on. But once you look at the numbers, you can see, I would say in general, when you see participation of women at festivals versus men in folk music festivals, I would say women are around 30% compared to men. And this goes for any genre, really. But also when you look at awards or prizes that give you respect and recognition and so on, again, women are around 30%, men 70%. When you look at competing competitions like Kaplek, is very interesting debates going all the time about why there are so many young girls and women participating when they're young until around they're 18. But once they are competing in the higher upper class called A-klassen, it's like 90% men, especially if you look at the Hardanger fiddle at the Hardanger fiddle in general. And why is this? Why are women not taking part of this competition when it's in the upper A class? Because there are so many women who have who are good enough to play there, but they avoid it. And when I've been interviewing so many women during this book project, from all kinds of ages, if they were 15 or if they were 80, all of the women would say, I always feel or felt that I had to play better, be more convincing, and not be too pretty, not be too beautiful, not be too loud, or not be too of anything. That's why I say I still think we are searching for our place, not to be copying a tradition where the discourse has been set by men, but to find our own true discourse within what is true to ourselves when playing this music, if it makes sense.
It's been so fascinating and so timely. So we wanted to ask about your daughter. Is she currently a musician? Do you think she might become a musician?
Oh, she's only 4 years old, so who knows? But she sings a lot. We'll see. But I, of course, will encourage her to do whatever she wants to.